My brother's restaurant grand opening cost my parents $280,000. The flowers alone ran $12,000. They flew in a jazz quartet from New Orleans. There were ice sculptures, a Michelin-starred guest chef, and a champagne tower that made it onto 3 different food blogs before the night was over. 2 weeks later, my son was lying unconscious in a pediatric ICU, and the surgeon told me he needed emergency brain surgery. The cost was $95,000. When I called my mother, I could still hear the celebration music in the background. She told me they were tapped out. She said it just like that. Tapped out. Like we were talking about a dry well, not her grandson's life. That was the moment something inside me cracked open, not into grief, not into rage, but into something colder and more permanent. A kind of clarity you only get when the last door closes, and you realize you have to build your own way through the wall. How do you beg for help from the people who made you believe you were never worth fighting for? How do you protect your child from a family that sees him as a footnote? And what happens when the people who smiled at every milestone of your brother's life pretend they never knew yours? My name is Elena Reyes. I'm a pediatric nurse. I work 12-hour shifts in the same hospital where my son nearly died. And this is the story of how I lost everything I thought I had and found out what I actually did. Caleb was 10 years old and fearless about it. He was the kind of kid who wore his helmet, but still somehow managed to turn every bike ride into an extreme sport. That Saturday in October, I was catching up on sleep after a night shift when my neighbor Mrs. Okafor knocked on my door. Her face said everything before her mouth did. He had taken the hill behind the park too fast and overcorrected on a patch of wet leaves. By the time the ambulance arrived, he had been unconscious for 4 minutes. I drove to the hospital in the kind of autopilot that takes over when panic is too big to fit inside your body. The whole way there, I kept thinking about his homework on the kitchen table. I kept thinking about the apple he hadn't finished. Small things. The brain does that when it's trying not to collapse. The neurosurgeon who met me in the hallway had kind eyes and a careful voice. There was a subdural hematoma bleeding between his brain and skull. Without surgical intervention in the next several hours, the pressure would cause irreversible damage. Possibly worse. I already knew what the surgery cost before she said the number. I had been a nurse long enough to know, but hearing $95,000, said out loud in connection to my son's name, still knocked the air out of me. I didn't have that kind of money. Caleb's father had left when Caleb was 3. He sent birthday cards twice and then stopped. There was no child support worth counting on. My health insurance through the hospital covered most routine care, but had a brutal cap on surgical procedures classified as emergency trauma. I had looked at the policy once and told myself I would figure it out someday. Someday had arrived at the worst possible time. I stood in the hallway with my back against the wall, phone in my hand, running through the short list of people who might be able to help. There was only one name that made any financial sense. My mother answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, distracted. I could hear a television and the clinking of dishes. She was probably watching her evening shows, a glass of wine nearby, the particular comfortable quiet of a house where the hard work is already done. I told her what happened. I told her the number. I told her I had tried everything and I needed help now. Not in a week. Not after paperwork now. She went quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Elena, honey, we just put everything we had into your brother's opening. The build-out went over budget, and we covered the shortfall. We are absolutely tapped out right now." I asked her to repeat that. She did. Same words, same tone. Like she was explaining why she couldn't lend me her car. I said, "Mom, he might not wake up the same." She said, "I know, baby. I'm so sorry. I know this is hard." I hung up before I said something that would live in both of us forever. I sat down on a plastic chair in the waiting room and just breathed for a while. Around me, other families did the same quiet, desperate thing that families do in hospitals. Praying, staring at phones, buying bad coffee from vending machines as if caffeine might somehow control outcomes. I opened my email to look for something. Anything a forgotten investment. An old savings account I had somehow overlooked. Instead, I found a folder I hadn't opened in over 2 years. Documents from my grandmother's estate. She had passed when I was 24. She had 2 grandchildren, me and my brother. I had always assumed the inheritance had been split equally. My parents had handled the estate. I had been working double shifts that month and signed what they put in front of me without reading closely enough. What I found in that folder stopped my hands over the screen. My grandmother had left each of us a portion. Yes, But there was a supplemental trust established through a family attorney, a discretionary account meant to be distributed for life-critical needs or career-building investment. My parents had been the co-trustees. My brother had received a $95,000 distribution from that account at 26. Startup capital, the document noted, for a food service venture. My name appeared once in the file. In a note dated 3 years ago, request for distribution dental emergency denied. Insufficient documentation. I sat very still. I had submitted that paperwork. I had a cracked molar that had turned into an abscess. I had been in pain for 6 weeks. The denial letter had come back without explanation, and I had borrowed money from a friend instead, paid it back over 8 months, and never asked about it again. I put the phone face down on the seat beside me and looked at the ceiling for a long time. There is a specific kind of grief that doesn't cry. It just settles. Into your shoulders, your jaw, the back of your throat. It moves in like a tenant who doesn't announce themselves and doesn't ever quite leave. They had given my brother the exact amount my son needed. And when the same account could have helped my son breathe through a different kind of emergency, they said they were tapped out. I made myself stand up. I walked to the vending machine and bought a water. I drank half of it. I walked back to the chair, and then I started making calls. The hospital's financial counselor was patient and thorough and offered me 3 different payment plan options. The most accessible one still required a $20,000 deposit before they could schedule the procedure. I had $11,000 in savings. I had a car. I had jewelry that had been my grandmother's. I had a laptop and a second monitor, and a bookshelf full of nursing textbooks that had cost me a small fortune in school. I started listing. At some point near midnight, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Marcus Webb. We had grown up 3 houses apart. We had lost touch after college the way you lose touch with people when life gets too loud to keep up. The message was short. Heard about Caleb. I saw the posting on the neighborhood Facebook group. Sending something now. Call me if you need anything. A transaction notification came through 40 seconds later. $2,500. I stared at it for so long the screen went dark. He hadn't asked what happened. He hadn't asked for updates or details or a payment plan. He had just sent it. I sat in that waiting room chair and felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since that afternoon. 2 hours later, Marcus had posted a fundraiser. He used a photo of Caleb from the neighborhood block party last summer, the one where Caleb had eaten 3 hot dogs and somehow still won the sack race. He was grinning in the photo with a ketchup smear on his chin and both fists in the air like a champion. The caption read, "This kid's mom taught our whole street what it means to show up for people. Now we show up for him." By morning, the donations were coming in steady. 20s, 50s, a few hundreds. Comments from people I barely remembered and some I had never met. A woman from Ohio wrote that she had been a pediatric patient herself once, and that no child should have to wait for help while the paperwork caught up. Each notification was a small proof that something good still existed in a world that had felt completely cold 12 hours earlier. That fragile feeling lasted exactly 3 days. It started with a comment on Marcus's post. Then another. Questions. At first, where's his father in all this? Why doesn't she have better insurance? I've seen scams like this before. The kind of skepticism that sounds like critical thinking but feels like something else entirely. Then my brother posted on his restaurant's Instagram page. A photo of the dining room, golden light, full tables, a glass of red wine. The caption said, "Some people mistake success for selfishness. We know who we are and what we built. Grateful for real supporters." He didn't tag me. He didn't need to. Anyone who knew both of us could read the room. His followers moved like a current. Within a day, the comments beneath Marcus's fundraiser had shifted from hopeful to hostile. Someone had found a 2-year-old review of a freelance work dispute I had been involved in completely unrelated, completely resolved, and posted it as evidence that I had a history of dishonesty. Someone else claimed to know me personally and said I was known for being dramatic. The hashtag came next. I won't repeat it. But it was the kind of thing that gets screenshotted and shared and eventually runs ahead of the truth. Marcus called me from the parking lot of his office, voice tight. "Someone is coordinating this," he said. "This isn't random trolls. The timing is too clean." I didn't respond for a moment. I was looking at my phone, scrolling through the comments, watching my son's name attached to words like fraud and sympathy play and attention-seeking. My son, who was 2 floors above me right now with a tube helping him breathe. The fundraiser momentum stalled. Donations slowed. 3 of Marcus's contacts who had been planning to contribute sent him private messages saying they needed to wait until things were clearer. The following morning, my department head called me into her office. She was careful about how she said it. There had been calls from people identifying themselves as concerned community members, questions about my professional judgment, a suggestion that my emotional state made me unfit for the floor. She was not placing me on leave. She wanted to be clear about that, but she was asking me to take a few personal days voluntarily while things settled. I walked out of that office and stood in the stairwell for a long time. This was no longer about the fundraiser. They were trying to take my job. They were trying to make sure that even if Caleb recovered, there would be nothing left for us to come home to. That evening, Dr. Patricia Osei found me in the break room. She had been a trauma attending for 11 years and had the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough emergencies to stay calm through almost anything. She sat across from me, folded her hands on the table, and looked at me the way she looked at patients who needed honesty more than comfort. "I know what's happening," she said, "and I know you're trying to carry it alone." I told her I didn't have another option. She reached into her coat pocket and set an envelope on the table. "You do now." Inside was a personal check for $18,000 and a letter from the hospital's internal staff emergency fund, a discretionary pool I hadn't known existed for an additional $9,500. I shook my head. "Patricia, I can't." "You can," she said simply, "because Caleb needs the surgery, and because I've worked beside you for 4 years and I know who you are, and because I'd want someone to do the same for me." Mrs. Okafor arrived the next morning with her daughter, and a covered dish that smelled like the best thing I had encountered in days. She had already been to my apartment. She had watered my plants, collected my mail, and left clean towels on the bathroom counter. She sat with me in the waiting room for 3 hours and never once asked me to talk about it. We watched a cooking show with the sound off, and she refilled my coffee twice without being asked. At some point, she put her hand over mine and said, "You didn't raise that boy alone, you know. The whole building helped. We were just quiet about it." I had to look away so she wouldn't see my face. The surgery was scheduled for Thursday. Wednesday night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the family lounge scrolling through messages on my phone, reading through the names of everyone who had donated even after the trolls arrived, even after the hashtag. There were more than I had counted. That was when I saw it. My brother had left himself logged into a shared family calendar app that I had been added to years ago. He had never removed me. I don't think it ever occurred to him that I was still in there, still able to see. There was a meeting on the calendar titled Damage Control E Situation, set for the Tuesday after Caleb's accident. Attendees: my brother, my mother, and someone listed only as PR contact. I screenshot it. I kept scrolling. There was a note thread attached. My brother had typed, "If this fundraiser gets big enough, it starts to reflect badly on us. We need to redirect the narrative before it gets legs." My mother had replied, "Agreed. Should we post something or let Mason handle the social side?" And then, below that, a third voice the PR contact had written, "Leave the posting to me." We seed a few questions in the comments, get it picked up as a controversy, and her credibility handles itself. People don't investigate. They just stop donating. I read it 3 times. I set my phone face down on the table. Then I picked it up again and forwarded everything to an email address I trusted. Caleb came through the surgery. The neurosurgeon found me in the waiting room at 6:14 inches the morning. She said the procedure had gone well. There would be recovery. There would be monitoring. There would be follow-up imaging over the next several months. But the bleeding had been stopped. The pressure had been relieved. He was going to wake up, and he was going to be himself. I sat back down in the same plastic chair I had been living in for 4 days, and I put my face in my hands, and I let myself fall apart for exactly 5 minutes. Not out of sadness. Out of relief so intense it felt physical, like something that had been clenched inside me for years finally let go. My mother called the next day. Her voice was different from the night of the accident, softer, more careful, with an edge underneath it that I recognized as preparation. She was preparing to be forgiven. "We've been so worried," she said. "We should have been there. I don't know how things got so complicated." I listened. "Your brother feels terrible. He really does. We didn't realize how serious it was until we saw the news about the surgery." I said, "It was always that serious. I told you it was that serious the night I called you." She paused. "I know. You're right. I know that now." I waited. "Maybe we could all sit down together," she said. as a family. Figure out how to move forward. There was a particular silence I held for a moment before I answered. The kind where you measure everything you're about to say and decide how much of it you actually mean. I'll call you back, I said. I didn't, but I did make another call to a woman named Rachel Thorne, who was a friend of Dr. Patricia's, and whose specialty happened to be defamation and tortious interference. I sent her the screenshots from the family calendar app. I sent her the PR contacts comment patterns. I sent her the documented timeline of the fundraiser disruption and the complaint to my department. She called me back the same afternoon. This is not complicated, she said. This is a paper trail. Caleb was moved out of the ICU on a Friday. He woke up slow and confused, which the doctors said was normal, and then he asked for orange juice and a specific video game and complained about the hospital socks, which was more normal than anything I could have hoped for. I sat beside him and held his hand and watched him argue with the nurse about whether his breakfast tray was acceptable, and I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. Marcus came to visit that afternoon. He brought Caleb a graphic novel and brought me a sandwich from the place down the street, from the hospital, that made the only coffee worth drinking within a 4-block radius. We sat in the hallway and talked for a long time. I want to do something, Marcus said. With the fundraiser, whatever's left after costs. I want people to know what actually happened. I told him I had been thinking the same thing. That evening, I set up my phone on the small table in the family lounge. I opened a live stream. I didn't filter it, didn't edit the framing, didn't do anything except look into the camera and start talking. I explained the timeline. I showed the screenshots of the calendar entry with the names. I showed the PR contacts comment thread. I showed the estate document with my brother's $95,000 distribution and my denied dental claim. I kept my voice even. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse anyone of anything that wasn't directly documented. I just let the truth exist in the light. By the time I ended the stream, there were over 6,000 people watching. By the next morning, it had been shared across 3 major Facebook groups. Rachel Thorne's office had already received 2 inquiries, asking if I had legal representation. My brother's restaurant had been tagged in over 1,000 comments. I didn't watch what happened to them in real time. I had other things to do. Caleb had physical therapy to start. I had shifts to return to. My department head had called the day after the live stream to say the complaints had been reviewed and dismissed, and that my leave was rescinded effective whenever I felt ready. I had an apartment that needed groceries and a neighbor who deserved a proper thank you and a son who wanted to watch movies from his hospital bed and needed me beside him. But I did hear things, gradually, the way you hear things when the world is small and connected. My brother's PR firm dropped him within a week. 2 of the investors he had been courting for a second location quietly withdrew. The food blogger who had written the glowing grand opening piece issued a public correction that she had not been aware of the full family context and no longer stood behind the piece. My mother's landscape design business, which she had been trying to grow into a second income, lost half its Yelp reviews to a wave of new ones in the span of 10 days. I didn't post about any of it. I didn't screenshot or forward or comment, not because I had forgiven them, that was a longer road than any single week could cover, but because I had learned something important about the difference between wanting justice and wanting to watch someone suffer. One of those things heals you, the other keeps you standing in the fire. My brother sent me a text message 6 weeks later. It was long and written carefully, and said several things I think he genuinely meant, and several things that sounded like he was still managing a narrative. He asked if we could meet. I wrote back one sentence. Not right now. It was honest. It was enough. Maybe someday there would be more. But I had learned not to spend my present on futures that hadn't been earned yet. Spring came to Houston the way it always does, sudden and loud and green everywhere you look. Caleb started back at school on a Tuesday and insisted on carrying his own backpack even though I could tell it was heavier than he wanted to admit. He was slower on his bike now, more careful. The fearlessness wasn't gone, just recalibrated. Some things change you like that, not by breaking you, but by making you smarter about where you put your weight. Mrs. Okafor planted tomatoes in the narrow patch of soil beside the parking lot fence. She recruited Caleb to help water them every afternoon, and he took the job with a seriousness I found deeply endearing. He kept a little notebook where he tracked how many days since planting and checked the water levels and reported back to her with the gravity of a scientist. "They're growing," he told me one evening, showing me his notes. "Yeah," I said. "They are." Marcus came over for dinner on a Saturday in April. Dr. Patricia came with her husband. Mrs. Okafor brought the kind of stew that takes all day, and fills an entire building with its smell. We ate around my kitchen table until it was too late to do anything but sit and talk slowly, the way people do when no one is in a hurry to leave. At some point, Caleb fell asleep on the couch with his shoes still on. I covered him with a blanket from the closet, the soft blue one that had been on his bed since he was small. I stood there for a moment and watched him breathe. It was so ordinary. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Later, when everyone had gone home and the kitchen was quiet, I stood on my small balcony with a glass of water and looked at the city doing its nighttime thing below. I thought about the phone call I had made standing in that hospital parking lot, about the way my mother's voice had been warm and distracted, about how I had stood in the stairwell after my department head's meeting and looked at my hands and asked myself how much I had left. I had thought, at the time, that I was asking about money, but I wasn't. I was asking about something older and harder to replace. Whether there was still enough of me left to keep going, whether the people who were supposed to want the answer to that question actually did, and what I had found slowly, in parking lots and waiting rooms and break rooms, and the narrow soil beside a parking lot fence was that there were people who did. Not the ones I had expected. Not the ones whose names were attached to trust funds or restaurant grand openings or champagne towers. Just the ones who showed up. I have worked enough overnight shifts to know what it feels like when something you thought was unfixable gets fixed. You don't celebrate loudly. You get quiet. You breathe. You do the next thing, and the next one. And you let the fact of survival be enough for that moment. Caleb's 6-month imaging came back clean. I framed the report and put it on the kitchen shelf between his school photo and the little pot of basil he had grown from seed. He thought that was extremely embarrassing. I didn't care. If there is something I would want anyone to take from any of this, it is not the part where the bad things happen to the people who caused them. That part is real, and I will not pretend it isn't satisfying on some level. But it is not the part that saved me. What saved me was every person who showed up without being asked. Every $20 donation from a stranger in Ohio. Every sandwich left outside a hospital room. Every hand placed over mine in a waiting room when there was nothing to say. I used to believe that family was where you started. A given, not a choice. Now I know that family is what you build when the given turns out to be something else. It is the people who come to your door with a lavender blanket and a bag of granola bars and don't ask any questions. It is the colleague who writes a check and slides it across a break room table like it's nothing, even though you both know it is everything. It is the neighbor who tracks tomato growth with your son and counts the days like they matter. They do matter. Every single one. If you're somewhere tonight feeling invisible in the place that was supposed to see you most, I see you. I know that feeling in the bones. And I want you to know that the people who were supposed to show up and didn't, that is their story. Your story is still being written. You are not the abandoned version of yourself. You are the version that figured out what was real, and that is not the ending. That is exactly how it begins. If this story hit close to home, drop something in the comments where you're watching from, or just a number if you've ever had to build your own family from scratch. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These are real stories about real people finding their way through. And they're worth telling.